Imagine two people standing on opposite sides of the same emotional battlefield. One of them feels everything too much. The other feels everything too deeply to let anyone see it. One reaches for connection when pain appears. The other reaches for distance. And then something strange happens. Both of them decide to disappear at the same time. No calls. No texts. No checking in. No, how have you been? No, I miss you. Just silence. Most people think no contact is simple. You stop talking and move on. But when an empath and an avoidant both go no contact, something entirely different begins. Because silence doesn't affect these two personalities the same way. To the empath, silence is loud. To the avoidant, silence is familiar. At least in the beginning. The first few days are usually deceptive. The empath wakes up and checks the phone. Nothing. A few minutes later, checks again. Nothing. The mind starts creating explanations. Maybe they're busy. Maybe they're thinking. Maybe they're waiting for me to text first. Maybe this is a test. Empaths are meaning makers. They cannot sit in emotional uncertainty without trying to solve it. Their brains immediately begin constructing stories to fill the empty space. The avoidant, on the other hand, experiences the first phase very differently. There is often relief. Not because they don't care. That's the mistake everyone makes. People assume avoidants don't feel. Actually, avoidants often feel too much. They simply learned a long time ago that closeness equals danger. Intimacy equals vulnerability. Dependence equals pain. So when no contact begins, a strange calm settles in. The pressure is gone. Nobody is asking for emotional availability. Nobody is requesting reassurance. Nobody is pulling them into conversations they don't feel prepared to have. They can breathe. And because of this, the empath and the avoidant immediately begin moving in opposite emotional directions. The empath's anxiety starts climbing. The avoidant's anxiety starts dropping. This creates the illusion that one person cares and the other doesn't. That illusion destroys people, because it's wrong. The avoidant cares. They just process attachment injuries in reverse. Think about this. When most people lose someone important, they move toward the pain. Avoidants move away from it. Distance becomes anesthesia. Silence becomes emotional pain medication. But medication eventually wears off. And that's where things get interesting. Because the empath cannot remain in uncertainty forever. Their nervous system begins sounding alarms. They replay conversations. They reread old messages. They remember every moment. They start analyzing. Did I say something wrong? Did I ask for too much? Were they ever real? Was I manipulated? Should I reach out? Should I stay silent? Every unanswered question becomes emotional fuel. The avoidant is doing something completely different. They're distracting, working longer hours, watching more television, scrolling more, seeing friends, finding projects, cleaning the garage, doing anything that prevents stillness, because stillness is dangerous. Stillness allows feelings to catch up. The avoidant doesn't fear emotions. They fear being overwhelmed by emotions. There's a difference. And this is where the no-contact period becomes psychologically fascinating. Both people are suffering. Neither can see the other's suffering. The empath interprets silence as indifference. The avoidant interprets silence as safety. Both are wrong. Days pass, then weeks. The empath begins moving through a withdrawal process. Because emotional connection creates chemical dependency. When you become deeply attached to someone, your brain expects access to them. It expects texts, voice, presence, attention, validation. When those things suddenly disappear, the brain responds similarly to withdrawal. The empath feels restless, unable to focus. Sleep changes, appetite changes, energy changes. The avoidant is experiencing withdrawal too, but it doesn't show up the same way. Instead of longing, they experience numbness. Instead of anxiety, they experience emotional flatness. Instead of obsession, they experience avoidance of thoughts. The mind protects itself. And then something happens around the point where silence becomes normal. The empath slowly stops waiting every minute. The phone gets checked less. Life begins returning. Friends become interesting again. Work becomes manageable again. The nervous system starts recalibrating. And exactly when this starts happening, the avoidant often enters an entirely different phase. The feelings arrive. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Quietly, a memory appears. A song triggers something. An inside joke resurfaces. A restaurant reminds them. A random smell. A location. An old picture. The emotions they successfully outran begin appearing in fragments. And because avoidants suppress instead of process, these fragments are often surprisingly intense. They suddenly wonder what you're doing, who you're talking to, whether you're okay, whether you've moved on, whether you hate them, whether you'll ever speak again. This is the phase people misunderstand. They think avoidants don't miss people. Actually, many avoidants begin missing someone after enough distance has been created. Distance creates safety. Safety permits feelings. When someone is close, the avoidant feels pressure. When someone is gone, the pressure disappears. Then, affection returns. This creates one of the strangest dynamics in human relationships. The empath misses you when you're gone. The avoidant can finally miss you because you're gone. And if both people maintain no contact long enough, something transformational begins. The empath starts rediscovering themselves. This is difficult, because empaths often overinvest in relationships. They become caretakers, fixers, emotional managers. Their identity slowly becomes connected to another person's emotional state. No contact interrupts that pattern. At first it feels unbearable, then it feels empty, then it feels peaceful, then it feels empowering. The empath begins remembering who they were before the relationship, their own interests, their own routines, their own dreams. And here's the irony. As the empath becomes more independent, they become more attractive psychologically. Not because they're trying, because emotional self-sufficiency changes energy. Neediness disappears. Desperation disappears. The emotional chase disappears. The avoidant senses this even without contact. Humans are exceptionally good at detecting changes in attachment dynamics. If the avoidant reaches out and discovers the empath is no longer emotionally starving, something unexpected happens. Respect increases. Curiosity increases. Attraction often increases. Because avoidants frequently fear engulfment more than abandonment. When they sense someone can survive without them, the relationship suddenly feels safer. At the same time, the empath undergoes another transformation. They begin seeing the relationship more clearly. Distance creates perspective. Without constant emotional stimulation, patterns become visible. The empath starts asking different questions. Why was I working so hard? Why did I ignore my needs? Why was I carrying the entire emotional burden? Why did I believe I could heal someone who didn't want help? These questions are uncomfortable, but they're powerful, because they shift the empath from longing into awareness. And awareness changes everything. The avoidant is experiencing their own version of awareness. They begin noticing your absence in practical ways. Who listened to them? Who understood their quirks? Who accepted them? Who remembered details? Who provided emotional warmth? Avoidants often underestimate someone's value while they've present, because intimacy creates anxiety. When the person disappears, value becomes visible. This doesn't automatically mean they'll come back. It means the emotional equation changes. Something else happens during mutual no contact that almost nobody discusses. Fantasy begins. The empath fantasizes about reunion. The avoidant fantasizes about reconnection without pressure. Neither fantasy reflects reality. They're projections. The empath imagines the avoidant suddenly emotionally available. The avoidant imagines closeness without vulnerability. Both fantasies are impossible unless both people grow. Because no contact doesn't change people. It reveals them. It reveals attachment patterns, emotional habits, dependency, fear, coping mechanisms. And if both people use the silence correctly, they evolve. The empath learns boundaries. The avoidant learns emotional accountability. But if they don't grow, then the cycle simply repeats. Reconnect. Feel close. Feel pressure. Withdraw. Pursue. Fight. Separate. Repeat. This cycle can continue for years, sometimes decades, because both personalities unconsciously trigger each other. The empath triggers the avoidant's fear of losing independence. The avoidant triggers the empath's fear of abandonment. Each person becomes the other's emotional wound. And strangely, that's often mistaken for soulmates. Intensity is not compatibility. Anxiety is not love. Longing is not destiny. A nervous system in distress can feel exactly like passion. Mutual no contact interrupts the addiction. For the first time, both nervous systems are forced to regulate themselves. The empath can no longer depend on reassurance. The avoidant can no longer depend on distance while keeping someone emotionally available. Both people face themselves. And that's why this period becomes transformative. Because silence removes distractions. The empath discovers whether they truly loved the avoidant or whether they were attached to potential. The avoidant discovers whether they wanted freedom or simply feared intimacy. These are different questions. Most people never ask them. Another strange thing begins happening after enough time passes. Memory changes. At first, both people remember the pain, the arguments, the disappointments, the unmet needs. Then memory starts editing. The good moments become brighter. The laughter becomes louder. The connection feels deeper. Human memory is selective. Distance often softens emotional edges. This is dangerous, because nostalgia can convince people that unresolved dynamics were actually perfect. They weren't. The relationship ended for reasons. The silence happened for reasons. And if either person forgets that, they risk repeating history. The empath may begin romanticizing. The avoidant may begin idealizing. Both become vulnerable to reaching out for the wrong reasons. Loneliness, guilt, missing familiarity, fear of starting over. None of those are sufficient reasons to reconnect. A healthy reconnection requires growth. Otherwise, you're simply reopening an old wound. Here's another fascinating thing. If the empath truly heals during no contact, the avoidant often senses it. Not through magic, through behavior. Silence feels different. The energy feels different. No indirect messages. No attempts to provoke. No emotional chasing. No hidden invitations. Nothing. The empath genuinely lets go. And paradoxically, genuine detachment often creates the space where the avoidant finally feels safe enough to reconnect. This doesn't happen every time, but it happens often enough to be noticed. Why? Because pressure disappears. Avoidants frequently move toward connection only when they no longer feel trapped by it. This creates one of the cruelest ironies in relationships. The empath wants connection most when the avoidant wants distance. The avoidant wants connection when the empath has finally found peace. Timing becomes the villain. One person arrives emotionally just as the other has left. And if contact happens at this stage, the conversation feels different. The empath is calmer. The avoidant is more vulnerable. There is less emotional urgency, more honesty, but not always. Sometimes the avoidant reaches out because they miss comfort, not commitment. Sometimes the empath responds because they miss potential, not reality. Distinguishing between those motivations determines everything, because people don't change simply because they miss each other. Missing someone and being capable of a healthy relationship are entirely different things. An avoidant can miss you deeply and still be unable to sustain intimacy. An empath can love someone intensely and still be unable to maintain boundaries. Love isn't the issue. Capacity is. This is why mutual no contact becomes a test, not of love, of growth. Can the empath tolerate uncertainty without abandoning themselves? Can the avoidant tolerate intimacy without running? Those are the real questions. Because relationships don't fail due to lack of feelings. Most fail because two nervous systems don't know how to coexist safely. And when an empath and an avoidant both disappear into silence, they each begin fighting invisible battles. The empath battles longing. The avoidant battles suppression. The empath battles fear of loss. The avoidant battles fear of closeness. The empath battles hope. The avoidant battles vulnerability. Neither battle is easy. Neither person is the villain. Both are responding to old programming. Programming usually written long before they met each other. Childhood experiences, past betrayals, attachment injuries, lessons learned from pain. The empath often learned that love must be earned. The avoidant often learned that vulnerability is dangerous. Then they meet. And suddenly each person believes the other holds the answer. The empath believes enough love can create closeness. The avoidant believes enough distance can create safety. Neither strategy works. No contact exposes this truth. Because in silence, there is nowhere to hide. Eventually the empath asks, "Why am I trying to save someone who doesn't choose me consistently?" Eventually, the avoidant asks, "Why do I keep pushing away people who care about me?" Those questions change lives. If answered honestly, some people never answer them. They jump into new relationships instead. The empath finds another avoidant. The avoidant finds another empath. The cycle repeats because the lesson wasn't learned. Pain is repetitive until it becomes educational. And silence can become one of the greatest teachers. Weeks turn into months. At this stage, something profound often happens. Acceptance. The empath accepts they cannot force connection. The avoidant accepts they cannot outrun attachment. Both begin understanding themselves differently. The empath realizes they deserve reciprocity. The avoidant realizes independence and intimacy can coexist. This is growth. And growth changes future relationships whether these two reunite or not. Because the goal of no contact isn't punishment. It's clarity. Clarity about yourself. Clarity about them. Clarity about what love actually requires. If reunion never happens, the empath leaves stronger. If reunion never happens, the avoidant leaves wiser. If reunion does happen, and both have grown, the relationship has a chance. A real chance. Because the dynamic changes. The empath no longer chases. The avoidant no longer runs automatically. Communication becomes possible. Boundaries become possible. Safety becomes possible. Without growth, none of that exists. Just chemistry. And chemistry alone can destroy people. Because chemistry is immediate. Compatibility is earned. The empath and avoidant often have extraordinary chemistry. That's why the separation hurts so much. It's difficult to walk away from someone who felt familiar, even if familiar meant painful. Especially if familiar meant painful. Humans are drawn toward emotional patterns that resemble childhood experiences. The nervous system mistakes familiarity for safety. An empath may feel compelled to rescue. An avoidant may feel compelled to escape. Both patterns feel normal. No contact interrupts normal. And interruption creates opportunity. Opportunity to become someone different. And an opportunity to stop confusing suffering with love. The opportunity to learn that relationships should not require constant emotional survival. There is another hidden layer to this. Both people begin wondering whether the other has changed. The empath wonders if the avoidant finally understands. The avoidant wonders if the empath still cares. Neither person can know. And uncertainty becomes a mirror. Whatever insecurities exist begin appearing. The empath fears being forgotten. The avoidant fears being rejected if they return. Both experience vulnerability. Both become human. Sometimes mutual no contact ends in reconciliation. Sometimes it ends in permanent separation. But it always reveals something important. You cannot heal another person's attachment style through sacrifice. You cannot earn emotional availability by loving harder. You cannot create intimacy by chasing. And you cannot create safety by disappearing. The answers are internal. Always. The empath must become someone who chooses themselves. The avoidant must become someone who can remain present. Only then can love survive. Otherwise, every reunion becomes another countdown to the next separation. Because unresolved patterns are patient. They wait, silently, until the right trigger appears. Then they emerge again. One person withdraws. The other pursues. One person needs space. The other needs reassurance. And the old dance begins. Mutual no contact is powerful because it stops the music. Suddenly, nobody is dancing. Nobody is reacting. Nobody is performing old roles. For the first time, both people stand alone. And standing alone can be terrifying. Especially for an empath whose identity became intertwined with connection. Especially for an avoidant whose identity became intertwined with independence. But in that fear exists possibility. Possibility of becoming secure. Possibility of creating different relationships. Possibility of understanding that love without emotional skills is often not enough. The empath eventually learns that being needed is not the same as being loved. The avoidant eventually learns that being alone is not the same as being safe. Those lessons change everything. And sometimes, months later, one of them reaches for the phone. Not because they cannot live without the other, but because they have become someone capable of a healthier conversation. Maybe the message gets sent. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe reconciliation happens. Maybe it doesn't. But by then, something fundamental has changed. The silence did its work. The empath became less afraid of losing people. The avoidant became less afraid of keeping them. And regardless of the outcome, that transformation is the real event that happens next. Not the text. Not the reunion. Not the dramatic return. The real change happens in the quiet places nobody sees. In the nights when the empath chooses self-respect over chasing. In the moments when the avoidant chooses reflection over escape. In the decision to stop repeating old stories. Because when an avoidant and an empath both go no contact, they're not just separating from each other. They're separating from versions of themselves that no longer work. And that process is painful, messy, confusing. But it can also be the first honest thing that has happened between them in a very long time. Because eventually, a strange realization starts creeping into both minds. The relationship may have ended, but the emotional conversation didn't. Silence has its own language. Every day that passes without contact says something. Every message that isn't sent says something. Every urge that gets resisted says something. The empath begins noticing the empty spaces where the relationship used to live. The morning text. The late-night conversations. The person they would normally tell about something exciting. There is grief in these moments. Not dramatic grief. Quiet grief. The kind that shows up while making coffee. The kind that appears in the middle of a grocery store. The kind that suddenly arrives because someone else laughs exactly the way they used to laugh. The avoidant experiences something different. They notice the absence of emotional demands. And at first, it feels lighter. But after enough time passes, the absence becomes noticeable in another way. No one is asking how they're really doing. No one is checking in. No one is paying attention to subtle changes in mood. No one is trying to understand them. Avoidants often don't realize how much emotional support they were receiving until it's gone. Humans rarely appreciate oxygen until they struggle to breathe. And that's exactly what begins happening. The empath is learning to breathe without the avoidant. The avoidant is learning what it feels like when emotional oxygen disappears. Another thing starts happening. Both people begin rewriting the story. The empath starts asking, was I too much? Was I too emotional? Did I expect too much closeness? And this question can become dangerous. Because empaths have a habit of turning another person's limitations into evidence against themselves. If an avoidant struggles with intimacy, the empath often concludes, I wasn't lovable enough. I wasn't patient enough. I wasn't understanding enough. But that's not reality. Another person's, his inability to give you what you need is not proof that your needs were unreasonable. That's one of the most difficult lessons an empath ever learns. At the same time, the avoidant starts asking different questions. Was I unfair? Did I leave too quickly? Did I push away someone who genuinely cared? Was I protecting myself from danger or from closeness? These questions are uncomfortable because they force self-awareness, and self-awareness can feel threatening, especially to someone who built their identity around independence. The avoidant often believes, I don't need anyone. I can handle everything alone. I prefer distance, until silence proves otherwise. Because everyone needs connection, even the people who are terrified of it, especially the people who are terrified of it. The avoidance challenge has never been needing less. Their challenge has been trusting more. Then something happens that almost nobody talks about. The empath stops putting the avoidant on a pedestal. This doesn't happen immediately. At first, the avoidant feels irreplaceable, special, unique, the only person who ever understood them. But time changes perspective. The empath starts remembering moments they ignored, the canceled plans, the emotional inconsistency, the mixed signals, the times they felt lonely inside the relationship. And this creates cognitive dissonance. Because suddenly two truths exist at once. I loved them. And they hurt me. Most people struggle to hold both truths simultaneously. They want a hero and a villain, a good person and a bad person. But relationships are rarely that simple. An avoidant can genuinely love you and still hurt you. An empath can genuinely care and still abandon themselves. Both things can be true. This understanding creates emotional maturity, and emotional maturity changes the entire no-contact experience. Because now the empath stops asking, how do I get them back? And starts asking, would getting them back actually make me happy? That question changes everything, because longing and compatibility are not the same thing. Missing someone doesn't automatically mean they belong in your life. Sometimes you miss a person who was wrong for you. Sometimes you miss a version of them that never truly existed. Sometimes you miss the hope of what could have been. The avoidant experiences a similar shift. At first, they miss the connection. Then they miss the comfort. Then they miss the person. But eventually another question appears. Could I actually do things differently? Because returning without changing means repeating. And deep down, avoidants know this. They may not always admit it, but they know. They know another reunion without growth will lead to another collapse. Because the old problems are still waiting. Unspoken fears. Communication difficulties. Fear of dependence. Fear of engulfment. Fear of rejection. Silence gives both people time to see the entire system, not just individual arguments. The entire system. How one person's fear activated the other person's fear. How one person's coping strategy triggered the other person's wounds. The empath pursued because they feared abandonment. The avoidant withdrew because they feared losing themselves. Each person's solution became the other person's problem. Think about how tragic that is. Two people trying to protect themselves, and in the process, accidentally hurting each other. No villains, just wounded strategies. But understanding this creates another danger. The empath may become too compassionate. They may think, now I understand why they acted this way. I should go back. I should wait. I should give them another chance. Understanding someone's wounds does not obligate you to remain inside them. You can have compassion and still have boundaries. You can understand someone's fears and still walk away. You can love someone and still recognize that the relationship isn't healthy. Those truths are difficult for empaths, because love and sacrifice often became connected in their minds. The avoidant faces a different temptation. They may reach out because the loneliness becomes uncomfortable. Not because they're ready. Not because they've changed. Just because they miss connection. This is where many avoidants unintentionally restart painful cycles. They come back before they're capable of staying. The empath interprets the return as transformation. The avoidant interprets the return as relief. And eventually the old patterns reappear. Because nothing fundamental changed. Silence alone doesn't create growth. Reflection creates growth. Accountability creates growth. Honesty creates growth. Without those things, no contact becomes nothing more than a pause. And pauses don't heal patterns. Another fascinating thing begins happening after long periods of silence. Identity shifts. The empath starts seeing themselves differently. Not as someone's rescuer, not as someone's emotional caretaker, but as a person with needs, boundaries, and value. This is huge, because many empaths secretly believe love must be earned through effort. They believe, if I understand enough, if I'm patient enough, if I give enough, then I will finally receive consistent love. But healthy love doesn't require emotional self-erasure. Healthy love doesn't demand that you abandon yourself to keep someone else comfortable. The avoidant undergoes a different identity shift. They begin realizing independence has limits. Being self-sufficient is valuable, but radical self-reliance can become emotional isolation. There's a difference between choosing solitude and fearing intimacy. One is freedom. The other is protection. Silence helps reveal which one it was. Then comes one of the most difficult phases. Acceptance without certainty. The empath may never know exactly what the avoidant felt. The avoidant may never know exactly how deeply the empath suffered. Some questions remain unanswered. No final conversation. No perfect closure. No complete explanation. And humans hate incomplete stories. The brain craves endings. It wants a final chapter, a reason, a clear answer. But many relationships end without one. Maturity means learning to live with unanswered questions. That is one of the hardest emotional skills in existence. Because closure often doesn't come from another person. It comes from your willingness to stop demanding explanations that may never arrive. The empath eventually realizes, I don't need every answer to move forward. The avoidant eventually realizes, avoiding difficult conversations didn't protect me as much as I thought. Both people become wiser. Sometimes they become softer. Sometimes they become stronger, usually both. Then one day something completely ordinary happens. The empath laughs again. A genuine laugh. Not forced, not distracted, real. And afterward they notice something. For several hours they didn't think about the avoidant. This moment feels strange, almost disloyal, because pain became familiar. Missing them became routine. But healing always feels unfamiliar at first. The avoidant experiences something equally strange. They think about reaching out, and then realize they aren't sure why. They miss the person. But they also recognize something. The relationship was more complicated than nostalgia allows them to remember. This is growth. Growth means seeing both the beauty and the difficulty, the connection and the incompatibility, the love and the pain, without choosing one over the other. And then there is the possibility nobody talks about. The possibility that both people heal, separately, never reconnect, and still become grateful for each other. Because some people enter your life to stay. Others enter to reveal something. A wound, a pattern, a belief, a fear. The avoidant may teach the empath to stop abandoning themselves. The empath may teach the avoidant that vulnerability doesn't always end in catastrophe. Not every relationship succeeds in the traditional sense. Some succeed because they transform the people involved. And transformation is often painful, especially when it arrives through loss. Months later, if these two cross paths again, something unusual may happen. They may feel affection without urgency, warmth without obsession, care without attachment. That is a sign of healing, because unhealthy attachment creates emotional emergencies. Healthy feelings create calm. The empath no longer needs to chase. The avoidant no longer needs to flee. Neither person is trying to complete themselves through the other. They have already begun doing that work internally. And that's the secret hidden inside mutual no contact. The silence was never just about separation. It was about interruption. Interrupting unconscious patterns. Interrupting emotional addictions. Interrupting stories that no longer served either person. Because sometimes two people need distance, not because they never loved each other, but because love alone wasn't enough to overcome the way they related to it. And when an empath and an avoidant both disappear into silence, something deeper than heartbreak begins. They enter separate classrooms, different lessons, different struggles, different fears, but both are studying the same subject. How to be close to another human being without losing themselves in the process. Because that's the hidden problem underneath almost every empath-avoidant relationship. Both people are terrified of losing themselves. They just fear it in opposite directions. The empath fears losing themselves through abandonment. The avoidant fears losing themselves through closeness. One clings, one retreats. One says, "Please don't leave me." The other says, "Please don't overwhelm me." Neither sentence is spoken out loud very often, but both are present in almost every interaction. And during no contact, those fears have nowhere to hide. The empath sits alone and starts noticing something uncomfortable. A lot of their emotional energy wasn't actually about the other person. It was about the meaning attached to the other person. Being chosen, being important, being enough, being irreplaceable. The avoidant represented something larger. Validation. Security. Proof that love could finally stay. Which means the silence isn't just removing a relationship, it's removing an identity. And that's why the pain can feel so intense. You're not only grieving a person, you're grieving who you thought you would become with them. The future you imagined. The conversations that never happened. The version of the relationship that existed more in hope than in reality. That's why empaths often suffer in layers. First they lose the person, then they lose the fantasy. Then they lose the role they played. And only then can they start finding themselves. The avoidant experiences their own layers. At first, they lose pressure. Then they lose familiarity. Then they lose emotional safety. Then they lose the person who knew them better than most people ever did. And eventually, they lose the illusion that they never needed anyone in the first place. That's the stage where things become incredibly difficult. Because avoidance can handle distance. What they struggle with is realizing they actually cared more than they allowed themselves to admit. There is a moment, and it doesn't happen for everyone at the same speed, when the avoidant begins remembering specific things. The way the empath looked at them, the way they listened, The way they remembered tiny details. The way they tried. The way they stayed. And suddenly the relationship stops being an abstract memory. It becomes personal again. The emotional walls soften. The intellectual explanations disappear. And feelings emerge. This is why some avoidants reach out months later and completely confuse people. Everyone says, if they cared, they would have contacted you immediately. Not necessarily. People process attachment differently. Some people feel everything immediately. Others feel it after the danger has passed. Some people cry during the storm. Others cry after it's over. The timing of pain doesn't determine the depth of feeling. It determines the coping strategy. But here's where it gets complicated. By the time the avoidant starts fully processing the loss, the empath may have changed. A lot. They've cried, journaled, analyzed, questioned everything, sat through lonely evenings, fought the urge to reach out, learned to regulate their emotions, started rebuilding their life. And because of that process, the person the avoidant remembers isn't exactly the person who exists anymore. No contact changes people, sometimes dramatically. The empath who once would have answered a message in 10 seconds may now take their time. The empath who once accepted breadcrumbs may now require consistency. The empath who once begged for clarity may now walk away from confusion. Growth changes standards. Growth changes tolerance. Growth changes attraction. That's why reunions can feel so strange. You're meeting someone who carries the same face but a different nervous system. And the avoidant changes too. The person who once disappeared during conflict may now communicate differently. The person who once feared every emotional conversation may now be willing to stay present. Or they may not, because growth is never guaranteed. Pain gives you an opportunity, not a promise. Some people suffer and evolve. Some people suffer and repeat. No contact doesn't automatically produce wisdom. It simply creates space where wisdom becomes possible. The empath eventually realizes something powerful. Love should not feel like permanent uncertainty. Connection should not require constant decoding. You shouldn't have to become a detective to understand where you stand with someone. That realization is liberating. Because empaths become exhausted. They spend so much energy reading between the lines, analyzing tone, studying timing, interpreting behavior, trying to solve emotional puzzles. Healthy relationships don't require that level of emotional investigation. And once the empath experiences peace, even briefly, something changes. Chaos becomes less attractive. Uncertainty becomes less romantic. The old relationship dynamic begins losing its power. The avoidant experiences a similar awakening. They start recognizing how much energy was spent protecting themselves, avoiding difficult conversations, keeping one foot out the door, managing closeness, maintaining emotional distance. Hyper-independence is exhausting. It's a full-time job, because you can never fully relax when you're always prepared to leave. Eventually, the avoidant asks a question that changes everything. What if closeness isn't the threat I thought it was? That question opens a door, a very uncomfortable door, because the answer requires vulnerability. And vulnerability feels dangerous to someone who learned that dependence leads to pain. But growth always feels dangerous. Every meaningful change requires stepping outside familiar emotional territory. For the empath, growth means tolerating distance without chasing. For the avoidant, growth means tolerating closeness without running. Neither skill feels natural. Both require practice. Both require courage. Then there is another stage of no contact that nobody prepares you for. Indifference begins to appear. Not coldness, not resentment. Just space. The relationship is no longer the center of your emotional universe. The phone doesn't control your mood anymore. Their absence doesn't ruin your day. Their memory doesn't stop your progress. This stage can feel almost unsettling, because when you've spent so much time emotionally attached to someone, peace feels unfamiliar. Some people mistake this peace for not caring. It's actually the opposite. It's emotional regulation. It's the ability to remember someone without becoming consumed by them. That's healing. The empath reaches this stage and begins trusting themselves again. They realize, I survived. I thought I couldn't, but I did. That realization is incredibly powerful, because every anxious attachment carries a hidden fear. If this person leaves, I won't be okay. No contact proves otherwise. You become okay. Slowly, messily, imperfectly. but you become okay. The avoidant reaches a different realization. I can miss someone and still survive. This is important because avoidants often fear emotional dependency. They fear needing someone, so they avoid attachment to avoid pain. But eventually they discover something. Pain isn't fatal. Longing isn't fatal. Grief isn't fatal. You can feel deeply and survive. That realization softens defenses. Then something unexpected happens. Both people become more secure. Not completely. Not overnight. But a little. The empath learns that abandonment isn't the end of the world. The avoidant learns that emotional intimacy isn't the end of freedom. And these lessons create possibilities that didn't exist before. Because secure relationships require two things: the ability to be close and the ability to be separate. The empath usually knows closeness. The avoidant usually knows separation. Both must learn the opposite skill. That's why these relationships can become such powerful teachers. Painful teachers, but teachers nonetheless. Months later, there may be a random moment. A notification appears. A name appears. A message arrives. And suddenly time folds in on itself. The heartbeat changes. The mind races. Old emotions wake up. Because attachment memories are powerful. The body remembers what the mind tried to forget. But now something is different. The empath pauses. The avoidant pauses. Neither person reacts automatically. Growth creates space between feeling and action. And in that space, wisdom lives. The empath asks, why are they reaching out? What do I actually want? What has truly changed? The avoidant asks, am I lonely? Am I ready? Am I reaching for comfort or connection? Those questions matter. Because old feelings can create new mistakes. Nostalgia is persuasive. Loneliness is persuasive. Familiarity is persuasive. But none of them guarantee compatibility. This is where many people make a critical error. They assume missing someone means they should return. Not always. Sometimes missing someone simply means they mattered. That's different. A person can matter deeply and still not belong in your future. A person can have changed your life and still not be your person. Those truths can exist together, and accepting them is emotional maturity. Eventually, one of the deepest realizations arrives. The relationship wasn't a failure, even if it ended, even if it hurt, even if it never became what either person hoped. Because some relationships succeed by teaching you what your nervous system needs. Some teach you boundaries. Some teach you self-respect. Some teach you communication. Some teach you what love cannot survive without. The empath learns not to abandon themselves for connection. The avoidant learns not to abandon connection for safety. Those are enormous lessons. Life-changing lessons. And perhaps the most surprising thing that happens when an avoidant and an empath both go no contact is this. The silence eventually stops being about the other person. It becomes about the relationship you have with yourself. Can you sit alone and still feel whole? Can you miss someone and still move forward? Can you love someone and still let them go? Can you accept that not every meaningful connection is meant to last forever? Those questions are difficult, but they transform people. Because in the beginning, no contact feels like punishment. Then it feels like loss. Then it feels like emptiness. Then it becomes clarity. And finally, if you stay with the process long enough, it becomes freedom. Not freedom from love. Not freedom from memories. Freedom from the belief that another person is responsible for completing you. And once both people understand that, something remarkable happens. Whether they reunite or remain strangers, they stop needing the old dance. The chasing. The withdrawing. The emotional emergencies. The desperate attempts to fix what neither person understood. Because now they know something they didn't know before. Real love is not found in intensity alone. It's found in the ability to stay present. To communicate. To tolerate vulnerability. To choose someone without abandoning yourself. And that understanding is often born in silence. The very silence both people feared. The very silence both people tried to avoid. The silence that finally forced them to meet themselves.